What betrayal unlocks? Inside a super empath, there is a moment that almost every deeply empathic person remembers, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it quietly changes the direction of their entire life. It is the moment when they realize that the pain they have been carrying is no longer coming from the betrayal itself. It is coming from the hope that the person who betrayed them will eventually become the person they needed all along. That realization is difficult, not because it destroys love, because it changes what love means. Today, we're exploring a question that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. What does betrayal actually awaken inside a super empath? Most people assume betrayal only creates pain. Psychology suggests something more complicated. Pain is often the beginning of the process, not the end of it. For many highly empathic people, betrayal becomes the event that forces them to examine patterns they had spent years overlooking. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they were naive, but because empathy naturally encourages understanding before judgment. When someone behaves inconsistently, an empath often asks, "What happened to them?" before asking, "What is happening to me?" That difference seems compassionate. Sometimes it is. But when it continues without balance, it creates a subtle problem. Their attention slowly becomes organized around understanding another person's behavior while gradually ignoring their own emotional experience. Without realizing it, they become experts in everyone else's inner world, yet strangers to their own. This is why betrayal becomes such a powerful turning point. For perhaps the first time in years, the empath is forced to redirect attention inward. Not because they suddenly stop caring about others, because they finally recognize that caring for others has been happening at the expense of caring for themselves. That recognition is uncomfortable. Earlier, self-sacrifice felt like kindness. Now it begins to feel different. It begins to feel unsustainable. The empath starts noticing something that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. They weren't simply giving love, they were constantly earning peace, trying to prevent conflict, trying to anticipate disappointment, trying to make relationships work through effort alone. Over time, this constant emotional labor became so familiar that it stopped feeling unusual. It simply became normal. Then betrayal interrupts that normality. Suddenly, every sacrifice is seen from a different angle. Every excuse, every second chance, every moment of self-doubt. Not to create shame, but to create awareness. Awareness is often the first gift hidden inside painful experiences, because awareness allows choice. Without awareness, patterns simply repeat themselves. With awareness, entirely different futures become possible. Another important shift begins happening. The empath discovers the difference between understanding and accepting. For years, they may have believed that if they could understand someone's wounds, then they should continue accepting behaviors that repeatedly caused harm. Betrayal challenges that belief. It teaches a difficult lesson. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do, without deciding that those behaviors belong in your life. Those are two completely different decisions. Compassion does not require unlimited access. Forgiveness does not require unlimited opportunity. Understanding does not eliminate the need for boundaries. For many super empaths, this realization changes every future relationship. Earlier, they looked for potential. Now they begin looking for consistency. Earlier, they believed words deserved endless chances. Now they pay closer attention to repeated actions. Earlier, they measured relationships by emotional intensity. Now they begin measuring them by emotional safety. That transformation doesn't happen overnight. It develops quietly, conversation by conversation, decision by decision, boundary by boundary. There is another psychological change worth noticing. Betrayal often exposes an unconscious belief many empaths carry. The belief that if they love someone deeply enough, patiently enough, consistently enough, the relationship will eventually become healthy. It's an understandable belief. After all, empathy is built on hope. Hope that people can grow. Hope that understanding creates change. Hope that love can heal. Sometimes those hopes are fulfilled, Sometimes they are not. Healthy relationships require something that no one person can provide alone: mutual responsibility, mutual honesty, mutual willingness to change. Without those qualities, even extraordinary compassion eventually becomes exhausted. This is why betrayal feels so profound. It doesn't simply challenge trust in another person. It challenges long-held beliefs about how relationships work. For a while, that uncertainty can feel frightening, but uncertainty also creates space to ask better questions. Instead of asking, "How can I make someone stay?" the empath slowly begins asking, "Who consistently makes me feel emotionally safe?" Instead of asking, "What more can I give?" they begin asking, "Is there healthy reciprocity here?" Those questions unlock something remarkable: self-respect. Not the loud, performative version often shown on social media, the quiet kind. The kind that no longer apologizes for having boundaries. The kind that no longer feels guilty for protecting peace. The kind that recognizes love is strongest when both people are carrying it. And perhaps that is the greatest transformation betrayal can begin. Not becoming harder, not becoming suspicious of everyone, but becoming wise enough to recognize the difference between relationships that ask you to abandon yourself and relationships that allow you to become more full why yourself. If betrayal begins the transformation, the next question becomes even more important. What exactly changes inside a super empath after the shock has settled? The answer isn't simply that they become stronger. Strength is only part of the story. The deeper change is that they begin seeing people through a completely different psychological lens. Earlier in life, they naturally gave others the benefit of the doubt. If someone's words and actions didn't match, they assumed there must be a reason. Perhaps the person was overwhelmed. Perhaps they were carrying old wounds. Perhaps they simply needed more understanding. That way of thinking wasn't foolish, it was compassionate. But compassion without discernment can slowly become self-neglect. Betrayal interrupts that pattern. For the first time, the super empath begins separating explanations from excuses. Understanding why someone behaves destructively no longer feels like a reason to remain in a destructive relationship. This distinction changes everything. Because healthy compassion says, "I understand your pain." Healthy boundaries say, "But your pain doesn't give you permission to create mine." Those two ideas can exist together. One does not cancel out the other. This is one of the first psychological shifts that betrayal unlocks. Another transformation happens almost invisibly. The super empath stops trying to convince people to value them. Earlier, they often believed that if someone truly understood their heart, appreciation would naturally follow. So they explained, they clarified, they gave second chances, they communicated again and again, hoping that one more honest conversation would finally create mutual understanding. After betrayal, something changes. They begin noticing a difficult truth. Some people don't misunderstand your value. They simply don't value the same things you do. No amount of explanation changes that. No amount of patience changes that. No amount of sacrifice changes that. Accepting this reality can feel painful at first, but it is also deeply liberating, because it ends a battle that was never truly yours to fight. There is another lesson betrayal quietly teaches. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your inner world. Super empaths often share deeply because authenticity feels natural to them. When they trust someone, they want the relationship to be real. They don't enjoy emotional games. They don't enjoy pretending. Unfortunately, openness without careful observation sometimes places profound trust in people who have not yet demonstrated they can handle it responsibly. After betrayal, that changes. The empath doesn't become secretive. They become intentional. Trust becomes something that grows through consistency instead of being offered immediately. This isn't emotional distance. It's emotional wisdom. There is a significant difference. Another psychological change involves intuition. Many super empaths later realize there were moments when something didn't feel right. Perhaps there were subtle inconsistencies, small lies, discomfort that couldn't yet be explained. Instead of listening to those signals, they often talked themselves out of them. I'm probably overthinking. Maybe I'm being unfair. Everyone makes mistakes. These thoughts usually came from kindness. But kindness directed only outward eventually becomes silence directed inward. Betrayal teaches a different lesson. Your intuition is not an enemy to overcome. Neither is it a perfect predictor of reality. It is information. Information deserves curiosity. Instead of dismissing uncomfortable feelings immediately, the healed empath begins asking, "What is my experience trying to tell me?" That question alone prevents many future patterns from repeating. There is another important transformation. The need for external validation gradually weakens. Before betrayal, many empaths unconsciously measured their worth through the quality of their relationships. If the relationship struggled, they questioned themselves. If someone withdrew, they wondered what they had done wrong. If someone became distant, they immediately searched for personal responsibility. Healing slowly reverses this process. Instead of asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" they begin asking, "Was this relationship capable of mutual respect?" Notice the difference. The first question attacks identity. The second evaluates compatibility. That shift protects emotional health in ways many people don't immediately recognize. Because your value and another person's ability to appreciate it are not the same thing. One exists regardless of the other. Perhaps the greatest gift betrayal unlocks is emotional independence. Not independence that rejects closeness, not independence that fears commitment, but independence that no longer depends on another person's approval to feel complete. This kind of independence creates healthier relationships rather than preventing them. Why? Because love becomes a choice instead of a necessity. The super empath no longer enters relationships hoping someone else will complete them. They enter relationships already connected to themselves. That changes every interaction. They become slower to ignore red flags, quicker to communicate honestly, more comfortable walking away from repeated disrespect, less interested in chemistry alone, more interested in emotional consistency. Over time, they discover something surprising. The qualities they once admired most begin changing. Intensity becomes less attractive. Reliability becomes more attractive. Charm becomes less impressive. Integrity becomes more impressive. Grand promises become less persuasive. Quiet consistency becomes far more meaningful. That transformation cannot usually be taught through advice alone. It develops through experience, through reflection, through painful honesty with oneself. And perhaps that is why betrayal, while never desirable, can become one of the most powerful teachers a super empath ever encounters. Because it doesn't simply reveal who another person was, it reveals who the empath is becoming. If betrayal begins with heartbreak, it doesn't have to end there. The final transformation isn't about becoming emotionally stronger than everyone else. It's about becoming emotionally honest with yourself. That may sound simple, but it is one of the hardest psychological shifts a super empath ever makes. For years, many super empaths define love by what they are willing to endure. They believe commitment means staying through every storm. They believe loyalty means giving another chance. They believe compassion means understanding every mistake. These qualities are beautiful when they exist alongside mutual respect. Without mutual respect, however, they slowly become the very things that keep someone trapped. Betrayal forces a difficult question into the open. What if love was never supposed to require abandoning yourself? For many people, this question changes everything, because they begin recognizing a pattern that had quietly followed them for years. Whenever conflict appeared, they became the one who adjusted. Whenever someone withdrew, they became the one who reached out. Whenever trust was broken, they became the one trying to repair it. Without realizing it, they had accepted responsibility for maintaining relationships that required effort from two people. Healing changes that. The super empath no longer believes every broken relationship is theirs to fix. Instead, they begin asking a healthier question. Is the other person carrying their share of the relationship? That question protects them from repeating old cycles. There is another transformation that deserves attention. betrayal often changes the way an empath experiences loneliness. Earlier, loneliness felt frightening. It created urgency, the urge to reconnect, the urge to explain, the urge to make peace, even when peace required sacrificing personal boundaries. After genuine healing, loneliness begins to feel different. It becomes temporary rather than terrifying. It becomes space rather than punishment. This shift is surprisingly important. People who fear being alone often tolerate relationships that slowly diminish them. People who become comfortable with healthy solitude gain something extremely valuable: choice. They no longer remain in relationships because they are afraid of emptiness. They remain because the relationship genuinely enriches their life. That difference changes every future decision. Another gift betrayal unlocks is clarity about character. Before, the empath may have been captivated by potential. They saw who someone could become, who they hoped they might become, who they believed existed underneath the confusion. After healing, potential becomes less persuasive than consistency. They stop asking, "Who could this person become?" and start asking, "Who are they repeatedly showing me they are today?" That question is grounded in observable behavior rather than hopeful imagination. It reduces confusion. It reduces emotional exhaustion. Most importantly, it reduces self-deception. There is also a profound change in the relationship the empath has with guilt. Earlier, setting boundaries often produced guilt. Saying no felt selfish. Walking away felt cruel. Choosing peace felt like giving up. Over time, those feelings begin to shift. The empath realizes that protecting emotional well-being is not an act of punishment toward another person. It is an act of responsibility toward themselves. Boundaries stop feeling like walls. They begin feeling like doors. People who respect them are welcome. People who repeatedly ignore them are not. That is not rejection. It is discernment. Perhaps the greatest surprise comes much later. One ordinary day, without planning it, the empath notices something remarkable. They haven't thought about the betrayal all day, not because they force themselves to forget, because their life has quietly grown larger than the pain. New friendships, new routines, new goals, new experiences. The betrayal has become part of their history rather than the center of their identity. This is often the moment genuine healing becomes visible, not when the memories disappear, but when they no longer control the direction of your life. Another important realization begins to emerge. The empath understands that forgiveness and reconciliation are different decisions. Forgiveness may help release bitterness. Reconciliation requires rebuilt trust. Those are not the same process. Someone may choose one without choosing the other. Recognizing this distinction removes enormous pressure. It allows compassion without requiring renewed exposure to repeated harm. There is one final lesson worth carrying forward. People often ask what betrayal takes away from a super empath. It certainly takes away innocence. It may take away certainty. For a while, it may even take away confidence. But if healing is allowed to unfold honestly, betrayal eventually gives something back. It gives discernment. It gives self-respect. It gives the courage to believe actions more than promises. It gives the wisdom to recognize that love and boundaries are not opposites. They are partners. The healthiest relationships contain both. And perhaps that is what betrayal ultimately unlocks inside a super empath. Not revenge, not emotional hardness, not permanent distrust. It unlocks a version of themselves that finally understands an essential truth. Your compassion is one of your greatest strengths. But compassion reaches its fullest potential only when it is guided by wisdom, when kindness is supported by boundaries, when generosity is balanced with self-respect, when empathy includes yourself as well as everyone else. That is the transformation betrayal cannot prevent. In many cases, it is the very experience that begins it. And once that transformation has taken place, the super empath doesn't become someone who loves less. They become someone who loves more wisely. They no longer confuse sacrifice with devotion, confusion with connection, or intensity with intimacy. Instead, they build relationships on something far more durable. mutual trust, mutual accountability, and the quiet confidence that real love never requires you to lose yourself in order to keep someone else. There is another transformation that rarely gets discussed, partly because it happens so quietly that many super empaths don't even recognize it while it is occurring. Before the betrayal, much of their emotional energy was focused outward. They were constantly reading the room, constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of relationships, constantly noticing subtle shifts in mood, behavior, and communication. This awareness is one of the reasons super empaths are often so supportive. They notice things other people miss. They sense discomfort before it is spoken. They recognize pain before it becomes obvious. These abilities can create extraordinary connection, but they can also create an imbalance. When too much attention flows outward, very little remains available for self-observation. The empath becomes highly attuned to everyone except themselves. Betrayal interrupts that pattern. Suddenly, the person they were focused on can no longer be the center of attention. Questions that were once directed outward begin turning inward. What do I actually need? What do I genuinely want? What kind of relationships make me feel safe? What have I been ignoring? At first, these questions can feel unfamiliar. Many super empaths have spent so much time caring for others that self-reflection feels almost selfish. Yet over time, they discover something important. Self-awareness is not selfishness. It is responsibility. Without self-awareness, even the kindest person can repeatedly walk into situations that harm them. With self-awareness, compassion becomes balanced by wisdom. Another unexpected change begins appearing in the empath's standards. Earlier in life, they may have been impressed by emotional intensity, grand declarations, deep conversations that lasted for hours, strong chemistry, powerful emotional experiences. These things felt meaningful because they were meaningful. The problem is that intensity and health are not the same thing. A relationship can be incredibly intense and deeply unhealthy at the same time. This realization often arrives slowly. The empath begins noticing that some of the healthiest people they meet are not the most exciting people they meet. Healthy people often appear ordinary at first, predictable, consistent, reliable. There are fewer dramatic highs, but there are also far fewer devastating lows. This shift changes attraction itself. Instead of being drawn primarily toward emotional intensity, the empath begins valuing emotional stability. Instead of asking, "How strongly do I feel about this person?" they begin asking, "How consistently does this person treat me?" That question protects them in ways they never expected, because consistency reveals character over time. Charm can be performed. Consistency cannot. There is also a change in how they respond to disappointment. Before betrayal, disappointment often triggered self-examination. They immediately searched for mistakes they might have made. Perhaps they communicated poorly. Perhaps they expected too much. Perhaps they were somehow responsible. While self-reflection is healthy, excessive self-blame is not. Many super empaths spend years carrying responsibility that was never theirs. Healing creates a more balanced response. When something goes wrong, they still examine themselves honestly. But they also examine the situation honestly. Responsibility becomes shared where appropriate rather than automatically internalized. This balance is incredibly important. Without it, relationships become one-sided. One person learns, the other person repeats. One person grows, the other person avoids accountability. One person carries the emotional burden for two. That pattern eventually becomes exhausting. Another lesson emerges regarding trust. Many people assume betrayal destroys the ability to trust. The reality is more nuanced. Betrayal often destroys blind trust. And that may not be a loss at all. Blind trust ignores evidence. Healthy trust considers evidence. Healthy trust develops gradually. It grows through repeated demonstrations of honesty, respect, and reliability. The healed empath learns that trust is not something owed, it is something built. This understanding changes future relationships dramatically. Instead of rushing emotional investment, They allow people to reveal themselves naturally. Instead of becoming attached to promises, they pay attention to patterns. Instead of focusing on what someone says they value, they focus on what their behavior consistently demonstrates. This creates a stronger foundation for every relationship that follows. Perhaps the most profound transformation involves identity itself. For a long time, many super empaths define themselves through what they give. They are the helper, the supporter, the listener, the rescuer, the one who understands. There is nothing wrong with these qualities. The problem appears when they become the entire identity, when self-worth depends exclusively on being needed. Betrayal often forces a difficult but necessary question. Who am I when I am not rescuing someone? Who am I when I am not fixing a problem? Who am I when my energy is invested in my own growth instead of someone else's recovery? At first, these questions can feel uncomfortable, but eventually they become liberating, because the empath discovers dimensions of themselves that had been neglected: creative interests, personal ambitions, friendships, goals, experiences that exist independent of caretaking. Their identity expands. They become more than the role they once played in someone else's life. And this expansion creates resilience, not because pain can no longer affect them, but because their entire sense of self is no longer attached to a single relationship. That is one of the greatest gifts healing provides: a wider life, a stronger center, a deeper understanding of who they are apart from anyone else's approval, attention, or validation. When that transformation occurs, betrayal loses much of its power. The event remains part of the story, the lessons remain, the memories remain, but the betrayal no longer defines the person. Instead, it becomes one chapter in a much larger journey, one that ultimately led them back to themselves.